The Apostle Paul is actually the Enigma code. There's no way when you have so many scholars come to the same man's literature and come out with so many different views. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Matthew Thiessen takes a deep dive, a scalpel, and says, look, here's what Paul's really doing. He's not anti-Torah, but rather he's fighting for what he understands the Old Testament to be and how that would apply to non-Jews, or better yet, non-Israelites. Stay tuned. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. Ladies and gentlemen, I have awaited this moment for a long time. Professor Matthew Thiessen is joining me today, and I really am. I appreciate you. I'm super happy that you came on. I found your video. It was like a Harvard discussion a long time ago on Gentiles and dogs. What an interesting topic. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Well, thanks for having me, Derek.
Thank you. I want to let our audience know up front what made me attracted and interested in diving deeper with you is for a long time scholarship has seen Paul as this guy who does an elbow in the story. He does this like historical conundrum for most people, and they go, Paul changed the game. Now, I still interview scholars who discuss this topic, and they say Paul is radically changing it. He's saying no to Torah. He's slamming Judaism and Jews, and hence anti-Semitism starts to show up on the scene, the way people interpret Paul throughout history. However, you, Paula Fredrickson, and wonderful scholars have come in and said, you know what? What if Paul is in Judaism and he's trying to interpret the scriptures potentially in some, I guess we could say, Hellenistic Judaism type of way? He's more on the lenient side, not super conservative as some people would maybe consider them. I don't know. I'll leave that to you. But you've written 2 books, and I want everyone to check them out, and then I'll shut up because I want to hear what you have to say. Here are a couple books that I highly recommend. There are more papers he's written here you can get, but Paul and the Gentile Problem, right here with the looks like a horn kind of going through Paul's head, and then Jesus and the Forces of Death. And I thought at first, I was thinking, what are the forces of death? Well, we're going to get into that today as well to find out more. And I want to commend you finally on Jesus and the Forces of Death. At the beginning of your book, you say, this is not a book to tell you the historical Jesus and what he actually did. I have people on the show that are mythicists that come on, PhDs, right? And they're like, well, he may not have existed. But then there are others who say, no, he did. There was definitely a guy. But knowing what he did behind the mythologized text that we may have, that's the conundrum that we can't quite answer. And that is something that I have to say thank you for in your book is like, I'm not trying to tell you exactly what the guy actually did. I'm telling you what the authors are presenting. So I'm done. What's Paul doing and what's Jesus doing in the Gospels?
How many hours do we have here, Derek?
Have a nice day. I'll be back.
Yeah. Well, which one do you want me to start with? Who do you want me to start with?
I think let's go chronology wise. Let's start with Paul because everyone loves to start with the Gospels, but Paul is earlier.
Yep. Yeah. So if I were talking about historical Jesus, would start with him chronologically. But yes, you're right. I'm not willing to go there. So starting with Paul, as you mentioned, it's been almost a 2,000-year tradition of reading Paul as abandoning Judaism, rejecting the law, condemning the law as being powerless, useless, outdated, and a whole other bunch of really negative things. And that, of course, expands to sort of a view of Judaism as a whole as negative, outdated, whatever. So, in my book, Paul and the Gentile Problem, I looked specifically at circumcision because I thought it's really easy to talk about law in the abstract, but what is Paul doing with circumcision here? And it became quickly apparent to me that, Paul has to be understood first and foremost as someone who thinks he's divinely designated to go speak, not to Jews, but to non-Jews. And so whatever he has to say about circumcision is, in the first place, directed to non-Jews, not Jews. So if he says don't get circumcised, he's not talking to Jews, he's talking to Gentiles.
Right.
And that's where we sort of, I think, can crack open this sort of nut that's so difficult to get with Paul in the law, is that getting the identity of his readers right, initial readers right, helps us understand the rhetorical purpose of his claims about the law and circumcision, which on the surface seem really negative.
And if I may, as we go along, I'd like to ask you specific questions pertaining to Paul's audience that I think just raise a bunch of red flags in my head and trying to like figure out what's going on. Because you're right. This is a complex piece of like this whole bit of Paul is super complex. You're in the vein of Paula Fredrickson on this idea. In her book, Paul the Pagan's Apostle was really fascinating. But I know some people who would suggest that Paul's audience, like I've said before, were somehow apostatized either Jews or apostatized Israelites in some ethnic sense or something like this.
Yeah.
And then they tie in somewhat to Jason Staples' ideas and go, well, Paul's using language that sounds like the lost tribes for his audience, therefore they must be lost tribes or something. I don't know if you have a comment on that, but I'd love to maybe get into your ideas of what you're saying, because a non-Jew, what is that? You know, that's everyone who's not a Jew. It seems to me universal, not only distinct apostatized Israelites. That's the thing that really...
So this really goes back, I think, in large part back to the work of Stanley Stowers in his really brilliant work on Romans, which the title doesn't show the brilliance. It's a rereading of Romans, which is sort of blasé. But again, this is Paul repeatedly telling us about non-Jews. He especially in Romans, for instance, he really telegraphs clearly. He thinks he's writing to non-Jews, and his depiction of non-Jews is exceedingly negative. He has them caricatured very negatively. They're idolatrous. They don't worship the right God. So all Gentiles, doesn't matter if you're Roman, Scythian, Greek, whatever, you're all lumped together into this sort of, mixed bag of everybody but Jews. And you're easily all lumped together because in Paul's mind, you're a bunch of idol worshiping, immoral people. You got a real problem on your hand, in other words, in Paul's mind. And there were some Gentiles out there in Paul's day who knew they had a problem and thought, Jews have the solution for us. And for some, that solution was the Jewish law. Apply it to Gentiles and that'll fix them. And Paul's argument is, no, your problem is so bad, actually, that the law is it's powerless to solve your problem. So it's not that the law is bad or anything, but you can't apply it to Gentiles and expect, successful results to appear. And so for Paul, his claim is that his gospel gives these Gentiles who have this huge, deep-seated problem, everything they need to solve this problem.
It's interesting you say that, because some people would argue, and I only am speaking for these particular people that talked about apostatizing. They would say, like, no one needed the law and no one was under the law. No one was given the law other than Israel. Yeah. Why would these non-Israelites, these Gentiles, ever even find an attraction to the law? But historically, Paula Fredrickson in her book, your work, point out that this funny little group called God-fearers do come on the scene. And it's like, these people found an attraction, for whatever reason, to synagogues in the diaspora and said, hey, we like this, but we're going to add it to our other deities list. And Paul comes along and is like, we're going to fix that, So I'm going with you on this road as we journey to discuss Paul and what he's doing. But they were also called dogs. There was a mention of this being discussed. Even in the gospel, there seems to be this place where Jesus even says something like this, as though this is giving you kind of a historical context, that this is the way things were understood in antiquity, how the Jews maybe viewed non-Jews.
Yeah. So if listeners and viewers are at all familiar with what's called the New Perspective on Paul, James Dunn and N.T. Wright most famously have talked about Judaism as an ethnocentric religion. And Christianity comes along. Paul and Jesus both come along and destroy this ethnocentricity for grace. They swap it out for grace for all, which is lovely. It sounds wonderful. Again, it's a negative caricature of Judaism,
right?
As racist. Essentially, ethnocentric is just a really long, multi-syllable word for racism. And the Gospels and Paul both have etnocentricity in them.
Right.
Jesus calling the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman, depending on whether you're reading Mark or Matthew, a dog, isn't a compliment. Mm-hmm. And it's based on the fact that she's non-Jewish. And then Paul, of course, he repeatedly characterizes Gentiles. But then I do think in Philippians 3, he talks about Gentiles as dogs as well. In Luke, whoever wrote the Acts of the Apostles, in Acts 10 depicts non-Jews as a bunch of unclean animals.
Good
so
point.
We have this, it's ethnocentricity, it's ancient ethnocentricity. And, Benjamin Isaac has detailed very nicely the sort of thoroughgoing nature of ethnic centricity in antiquity. Jews aren't unique in this regard. And this Jesus movement doesn't break from it at the end of the day. And in fact, they find thinking with animals obviously very helpful. Gentiles are akin to dogs. That doesn't mean they're immoral. They are immoral, but a dog isn't immoral. It's just something that's sort of genetically or genealogically impure and distinct from kosher animals. And nothing you do to a dog or a pig or anything can make it clean. Its DNA is such that you can't, wash it or clean it or make offerings or anything that's going to cleanse it and turn it into a pure animal.
Right.
Which then, if that's the Gentile problem, if it's sort of rooted in one's DNA, so to speak, what's the solution? Well, it's got to be sort of some massive divine intervention that rewrites Gentile DNA.
I think you have a very good way of putting words, by the way. I really appreciate this already. This is fascinating because that seems to be this solution here. It's a spiritual solution, according to Acts. And look, I come at this, I'm very transparent. I'm a skeptic, but sure. I love the Bible. Like I actually do. I'm not like the guy who's just like, we're going to bash everybody. And it's, some people might feel that way at times when I'm highly skeptical about a conclusion. But the bottom line is Acts and the vision. I find it very interesting that Peter's the guy that bumps into Cornelius. It's like, this guy didn't have Paul bump into him. He had Peter on purpose because Peter represents the faction that's to the circumcision. And here he is going, there's no way. And God has to bring a vision to him. And boom. Well, how do we have clean become or unclean become clean? God makes that happen. And so the question then becomes, how do we get from, this is this what Christianity's doing? Is this what makes it so unique? Is it saying these unclean people are now being made clean, but not because of Torah?
Yeah. So there are a diversity of thoughts that ancient Jews had about Gentiles. Paula Fredrickson, who you've mentioned, she's said Judaism doesn't have a view about the Gentiles. Jews do. Judaism doesn't think and doesn't have a conclusion. It's an abstraction, right? Individual Jews, just like modern day Christians or Americans or whoever, have views of things. And as we know very clearly from the last, especially the last few years, there can be diversity of opinions and much conflict within different groups. Some Jews thought Gentiles, all they had to do was worship the supreme God and stay clear of certain, sort of big sins. And they were what some scholars talk about as ethical monotheists. Others thought actually they needed the law. They needed to apply it to them, or at least they could benefit from it if they chose to. And others thought, some thought, and I think like the Book of Jubilees, for instance, is one of these cases. Gentiles are they're out of luck. They're not God's people. They'll never be God's people. They can't become God's people. And so there's a whole diversity of thought, and that we see that in this early Jesus movement too, because some Jewish believers in Jesus think, well, we need to apply the law to Gentiles, and others are saying the law doesn't apply to Gentiles. or at least doesn't need to be applied. So I think there's a spectrum of thought there too. And Paul comes down. So, you mentioned earlier language that I think is very familiar to us modern people. What was the language you used? Paul is more not lackadaisical, but
but he's more liberal about it. He's not as conservative,
right?
Is strict in the same sense.
So I would push back. This is a very common view of Paul. He's this Paul of liberty and freedom,
right?
And he uses this language, and he thinks he is, I think. But he doesn't say to Gentiles, well, look, if you want to get circumcised, you go for it, but you don't need to. He actually says, hell no, don't get circumcised. It's not an apostle of freedom. And this is something Albert Schweitzer, who over 100 years ago noted, he's not the apostle of liberty. He's saying you can't get circumcised. You do it and you're done. And so one of the things one of the arguments I make in my book that I think is relatively novel and hopefully correct is that I think Paul thinks you just can't apply. It's impossible to apply the law, in circumcision in particular, to non-Jews. And when they do it, they make a category mistake. It's like trying to slaughter a pig to drain it of its blood so you can eat it. It doesn't make it kosher. It's still a pig. And it's the same with the Gentile. Circumcise a Gentile, it's just a circumcised Gentile. And there were circumcised Gentiles in the ancient world. Jews weren't alone in practicing circumcision. So I think Paul thinks, this is like, and this is the analogy I use in the book. He thinks circumcision and applying the law to Gentiles is ultimately little more than cosmetic surgery. It might make you look right, but it doesn't actually justify you before God. You're still a Gentile. It doesn't make you non-idolatrous. It doesn't make you moral. You need this infusion of the divine spirit and the Messiah's spirit, which then connects you to God and connects you to Abraham, which is important for Paul. So there's that ethnocentricity again, connects you to Paul, and it gives you sort of moral steroids so that before you couldn't lift the burden of doing good. Now you have this infusion of steroids, and now you are empowered to live in ways that Gentiles in Paul's mind couldn't previously do.
I love this. And before we get off Paul, because he's such an interesting topic, your first book, we'll get to your second one. The idea that you mentioned Paul's ethnocentricity to Abraham. Yeah. Galatians 3 is a very interesting passage. Obviously, he's arguing exactly what you're talking about. It seems to me when I read this, and I'm no scholar, but I've been reading it for a while and listening to various scholars. I've interviewed 30 different, guys, if you will, and girls on this topic. Paul's saying, my message was true. My gospel's right. Anyone else who teaches another one, hint, hint, a Torah observant type of version of this, of Christ and the law. It seems like he's going down that rabbit hole. And when he gets to Galatians 3, I just want your opinion on this. He's talking about the gospel being preached to Abraham before he was even circumcised, right? So he was justified by faith before any of that. So you don't need to either. And there was a promise that he would be a blessing to all the nations. Then he goes on to say, and if my reading of this is correct, that the seed, he's saying this is not many descendants. I don't know if this is a convoluted argument or not. I wonder what he's trying to do to try and make the argument.
Yeah.
He's taking Genesis and saying that it's to Christ specifically, not to all of these descendants. And these people who are probably opposing Paul's ideas or going to the Galatian church, they're saying you need to convert in order to become a descendant of Abraham, to become a seed. And he's saying, no. It's all in Christ. Am I right about this?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. So Galatians, we see Abraham pop up, especially in Galatians and in Romans, where it seems like circumcision is, front and center of Paul's mind, and the law and Gentiles. And it looks like he's responding to claims. We're sort of, what's what John Barclay calls mirror reading. We're trying to sort of read behind the letters to see, well, what's Paul responding to? And it looks like people are claiming, A, you need to be descended from Abraham if you're a Gentile to get the promises that God made to Abraham. And the way to do it is to, like Abraham, who was a Gentile himself, get circumcised. and then you'll enter into this covenant, and all those covenant promises from Genesis 17 are yours. Of course, Genesis 17 is not a text about conversion, not a text about if any future non-Israelite wants to join the people of Abraham, all they have to do is this. The whole point of Genesis 17 is this is for Abraham and for his sons and their slaves. The slaves, of course, are just in the household. They're not actually inheriting children. They're just slaves.
Right.
And so Paul actually really, I think, plays with Genesis 17 along these lines.
With his slave ideas too?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, wow.
And then that weird allegory in Galatians 4:21 through 31 with Abe actually has two sons and they're both circumcised. So you want to get circumcised as a Gentile, you're going to become a son of a sort, but it's the son who's a slave. You're going to become like Ishmael. Why? Because you're not actually doing covenantal circumcision. Covenantal circumcision is, according to Genesis 17 and Leviticus 12, eighth-day circumcision. Any other circumcision doesn't actually fulfill all the requirements of the law. And so if you get circumcised after the eighth day, you have a circumcision that's very similar to one of Abraham's sons, Ishmael. He's the wrong son. He doesn't inherit. And in fact, he gets kicked out of the house. And Paul even mentions this in Galatians 4, that you have to cast out the slave woman and her son. And so Paul's point is you become an Ishmaelic son of Abraham, not a son like Isaac, and therefore you don't inherit if you try to become a son via circumcision in the law. But then Paul says, great news. I agree. You have to become a son of Abraham. You have to get the promises.
Right.
But there's a really sort of cool, weird way. And this is Paul's intricate argument in Galatians 3. Abraham's seed is the Messiah, is a claim he makes. And it's in the Messiah that one can access these promises. How? Well, because as a Gentile, if you place your trust in the Messiah, this releases the Messiah's spirit, his pneuma, and it is injected into your body. And it forges. So when we talk about spirit, it's very easy in the modern world to think of sort of non-material or not real. Right. Paul, and I think he's indebted to ancient physics of his day here. He never comes out and says it explicitly, but I think his readers would hear it. He thinks of spirit as something material. It's physical. It's the best matter out there, much better than this stuff, which gets wrinkles and gets old and dies and then decomposes. Spirit, pneuma, is eternal, imperishable, unchanging.
And this might tie into his resurrection too. I think
precisely.
Precisely. I love this. Okay.
You get this injection of the Messiah's pneuma, and you have an unbreakable bond, not only to the Messiah, which is good, but to the Messiah's forefather, Abraham. And so I think Paul has this deeply materialist understanding of Gentiles getting connected to Abraham. So instead of this cosmetic surgery of circumcision, it's this genetic therapy of receiving the Messiah's pneuma. And the Messiah's pneuma is connected genetically, genealogically to Abraham. So you need Abraham. This is how you get there. By the Spirit, not the law.
I love this. That's actually a wonderful argument that Paul's, come up with. It's a really interesting one, especially when you look at the narrative, because the way you just described it, that makes sense. If you're looking at it, the way he's looking at it makes sense. And I could get why Jews would argue, because that's what they do. They love to debate and have these talks. So you've made my interest have to ask one more question before we leave Paul, because I suspect as you talk about your new book, you might jump to Paul occasionally too.
Sure.
But Romans 9 through 11 is you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as I said that, boom, boom, boom. You have Dr. Jason Staples, who wrote his article in 2011. He's currently writing his thesis or his book about the Old Testament. He just finished. I read that. Now the New Testament he's working on, trying to get to Paul.
Yeah.
In what ways, and I know you guys respect each other, even if you would disagree at the end of the day, your colleagues, in terms of you guys are experts in the field, this is what you guys do. What do you think about his theory, and how do you differ?
Yeah.
Or like, what would you say is happening in Romans 9-11 if you don't agree with his theory? I'm interested because I know there's a couple different ways to look at this.
Yeah, I've read his Romans 11 article. I'm looking forward to reading his Paul book when it comes out, to learn from him. I think where he sees the northern tribes, and we've both, some of our research has overlapped here on the idea of the lost northern tribes and concern for them in other texts, including texts from Qumran. Mm-hmm. I don't see that in Romans 9-11, but I would be delighted to see that there. I think Paul just thinks of these Gentiles as straight up Gentiles who God has taken a detour on, and has done so by hardening or temporarily hardening Israel so that they don't all believe, which of course for Paul is
the Jews, right?
Yeah. Sorry, Jews. Yeah. And this is, I know Jason wants to make a real sharp distinction between Israel and Jew. I'm not entirely sure I see that, but I need to think more about it, to be honest. So
it is interesting because he gets to Romans 9-11 and he wants to say that Israel is the word that comes up instead of Jew, which he presents Jew previously. And this is interesting. He could be right. But when I go to Acts, and I know it's a different book, definitely even later, we see in Acts 13, for example, men of Israel and those God-fearers among you, or those Gentiles who fear God among you. Yep. Men of Israel, are we saying the northern tribes there? No, obviously, it sounds to me that we would go ahead and say the Jews represent Israel in Acts. No. And this is this big debate he's got where he takes on John J. Collins and other people and says, you guys think the Jews or the Jerusalem people in the South have now become Israel, and that there's not this restoration theology, so to speak. It might pop its head up from time to time, but it's not like the way he wrote his book all the way through the Old Testament, every book you can go to, and it's all teaching that. But I don't know.
No. Yeah, as I said, I'm a little skeptical about some of those distinctions, but maybe when I see his full Paul book, I'll be convinced.
So then 11:25 in Romans, the idea that all Israel shall be saved when the full number of the Gentiles, how do you take that right now?
Yeah. So I take it as Paul thinks there is a temporary stoppage in time, and God's collecting up the non-Jewish and non-Israelite nations. He's vacuuming them up. And once their full number comes in, then God is going to sort of press play again on the story of Israel writ large, and then they're going to come to believe. So the whole point is a lot of Jews aren't believing, so I think he conflates Jews and Israel. Maybe it's not a one-to-one match, but I think it's close for Paul. There's a temporary pause to vacuum up the Gentiles. It's going to God's going to hit the play button again as soon as he's done getting the Gentiles in. So I don't take it as that the Gentile salvation is part of what it means for all Israel to be saved.
Right.
I take it as and after the Gentiles, the full number of Gentiles have been brought in, then God's going to redeem Israel.
Interesting.
Which of course, Paul's, thoroughgoingly apocalyptic, and he thinks the end is nigh in his time. I think we have a couple thousand years of evidence that it wasn't, not in the way Paul imagined.
Right.
And so I don't know, we're Paul here today, how he would rewrite Romans 9-11 in light of that. But I think he thought Paul was at the forefront of this mission to get all the Gentiles vacuumed up. And shortly after, then all Israel would believe. And clearly that didn't happen in Paul's time.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.